The basement of the Pike County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper on the third Tuesday of April, and Adeline Merrick, 71 years old, sat in the second-to-last folding chair with a coffee can of money zipped inside her handbag. She had counted it 4 times at the kitchen table of the rented room on Ash Street, and it came to $2,900 and some odd change, which was every dollar she had in the world that was not spoken for. Her cardigan was the color of oatmeal and darned at both elbows, and she kept her hands folded on top of the handbag the way a woman does when she is trying not to look like she is guarding something. Up front, the county clerk, a heavy patient man named Bernard Teal, was working his way down a list of surplus parcels the county had taken for unpaid taxes, and most of them went the way such things go: a half-acre of weeds behind the co-op, a strip of ditch land, a burned-out lot on 2nd Street that nobody wanted and nobody bid on. When he came to item 19, he had to clear his throat twice. Item 19, he said, is 14 and 1/10 acres on the north side of the old highway. Improvements listed as 1 outdoor theater screen tower, 1 concession and projection building, 1 ticket booth, 1 steel marquee, and a quantity of speaker posts. Taxes owed, $2,840. Minimum bid to clear the county, $2,900. Somebody in the second row laughed out loud, a young man in a quilted vest who had come to bid on a snowplow blade, and the laugh went around the room the way a laugh does in a small place where everyone already knows the joke. "It is the meadowlark," somebody said. "It has been dead since before that boy was born." Bernard Teal looked over the top of his glasses and said, "Do I hear 2,900? Nobody moved. He said it again, and the radiator ticked, and a woman up front went on knitting, and the young man in the quilted vest said, "Loud enough for the room, I will give you $1 and a ride to the dump for it." That got the second laugh, the mean one. And it was still hanging in the air when Adeline Merrick raised her hand. She did not raise it high. She raised it about to the level of her shoulder, the way she used to raise it in church when they asked who would take the flowers home, and she said, in a voice that carried farther than she meant it to, 2,900. The room turned around in its chairs. Bernard Teal, who had known her 40 years and had bought sweet corn from her husband every August of his adult life, took a long moment before he said, "Ada, you understand what you are bidding on." She said she did. He said, "It is condemned. There is a placard on the door. The county will not carry insurance on it, and neither will anybody else." She said she understood that too. He asked once more for any other bid and got nothing but the sound of 40 people deciding they had better not, and then he brought the gavel down on a block of scarred oak and said, "Sold to Adeline Merrick, item 19, $2,900. She stood up and walked to the front and set the coffee can on the counter and unscrewed the lid. And the room watched an old woman count out $2,900 in 10s and 20s and a great many 5s, smoothing each bill flat with the side of her thumb, and nobody laughed during that part, which she noticed and was grateful for. The clerk gave her a numbered receipt and told her the deed would be recorded in 10 working days and that she should read the schedule attached to it, because the county's schedule listed what conveyed with the parcel, and the county did not want any argument later about what was hers and what was not. She said she would read it. She read it in the truck, in the courthouse parking lot, with the engine off and the April wind pushing at the windows. The schedule was typed on a form that had been photocopied so many times the letters had furred at the edges, and it listed the land by metes and bounds, and then it listed the improvements, and then, at the bottom, in the flat, unhelpful language of county paperwork, it listed the contents. All structures and their contents in place as of the date of abandonment, including but not limited to the projection booth and equipment therein, said booth reported secured and not entered by county personnel. She read that last line 3 times. not entered. In the whole of Pike County there was one door nobody had opened since the Meadowlark Drive-In Theater shut its gate after the second feature on the 9th of September, 1979, and as of about 11 minutes ago, that door belonged to her. She had not come to the sale on a whim, whatever the town decided to say about it later. She had come because 6 weeks before, on a Sunday afternoon that she still could not think about straight, she had signed her name at her own kitchen table and stopped being a woman who owned a house. It had been done kindly, which was the part that stuck in her throat. Her son Dean had brought coffee cake. He had brought his wife Shauna in a folder with tabs on it. And he had spread the papers out over the oilcloth and said, "Mom, you are 71 and you are alone out here, and the furnace is 30 years old, and the taxes went up again, and this is the smart thing. This is what people do. The place would sell, the money would go into an account, and she would take the front room at the Ash Street house that Shauna's cousin rented out, which was clean and warm and close to the clinic and had a window that got the morning. She had lived in the farmhouse on Quarry Road for 46 years. She had come to it at 25 with one suitcase and a sewing machine, and Ray Merrick had carried her over the sill because he thought it was funny, and she had buried him out of that front room and raised 2 children in it and canned in its kitchen until the shelves in the cellar went 4 deep. She signed. She signed because Dean was not wrong about the furnace. And because Shauna kept saying, we think, we worry, and because when she looked at her son's face, she saw that he had already decided and that fighting him would cost her the Sundays. She kept a box of Ray's tools, her mother's clock, her canning jars, and the coffee can. Everything else went in a 2-day sale conducted on the lawn by a man from Fremont who priced her wedding china at $4 a place setting because that is what wedding china goes for now. And then the money did not come to her exactly. It went into an account, and the account had Dean's name on it beside hers for convenience, and when she had asked in March about the coffee can money. The little bit she had kept back that was hers before there had ever been an account, Dean had laughed and said, "Mom, do not go buying magic beans." She had not told him about the sale. She had read about it in the county paper, in agate type on the page with the drainage notices, and she had folded that page and put it in her cardigan pocket and carried it around for 11 days. She drove out to the property that same afternoon because she could not have stayed in the front room on Ash Street with that receipt in her purse if her life had depended on it. The old highway ran north out of Arden Grove past the grain elevator and the closed implement dealer and then out where the shelter belts start, and the Meadowlark was 3.5 miles up on the right. Behind a fence line that had gone to Volunteer Elm, she would have driven past it if she had not known. The marquee was still standing at the road, a steel A-frame 22 feet high with a neon meadowlark on the top that had lost most of its glass tubing, and the letterboard still held the last 4 letters anybody had bothered to set, an S, a T, an A, and a Y. The ruined leftover of some longer word, so that for 46 years the sign at the entrance of the Dead Drive-In had said "Stay" to the empty highway. Adeline sat in the truck at the mouth of the gravel entrance for a while, looking at that. Then she got out and dragged the county's chain off the gate post, and the gate itself came off its hinge and lay down in the weeds like it had been waiting for permission, and she walked in. 14 acres opens up around a person. That was the first thing she had forgotten in all the years since she had last stood in it, that a drive-in is not a building. It is a field with a shape imposed on it, and the shape was still there under the grass. The ramps ran away from her in long grassy waves, 7 of them, each one humped so the front wheels of a car would ride up and tip the windshield toward the screen, and along every ramp stood the speaker posts, iron pipes set in concrete, each one with its little gray cast metal head still on the hook or hanging by a wire or lying in the weeds where it had been dropped in September of 19. 79 and never picked up. She counted the posts on the near ramp and got to 31 before she stopped counting, and she thought, "My Lord, they are all still here." And at the far end, filling the whole north side of that field, stood the screen tower. She had remembered it as big. It was bigger than she had remembered. 60 feet of it, a great white-faced wall of painted steel panels on a lattice of trusses, 90 feet wide, tilted back on its legs like a face turned up to the sky, and the paint on it had gone chalky and streaked, but the shape of it had not moved a quarter inch. Swallows were going in and out of the trusswork. The whole structure hummed a little in the wind. A low sound that was not quite a note, and Adeline Merrick, who had signed away a farmhouse 6 weeks before without crying, stood in the grass in front of that screen and cried for about 90 seconds, and then wiped her face on her cardigan sleeve and went to see about the buildings. The concession and projection building sat in the middle of the field. Low and flat-roofed and built of cream-colored concrete block with a wide overhanging canopy on the front, and it was in better shape than the county's placard suggested. The windows were boarded. The concession door had been forced at some point, and inside there was the long steel counter and the popcorn machine with its glass smashed and the cases where the candy went. And pigeon mess over everything, and a raccoon had been living in the ceiling for enough generations that the ceiling had opinions about it. The county's placard, orange and faded, was stapled to the doorframe and said the structure was unsafe for occupancy and that entry was at the entrant's own risk, and Adeline read it and thought, well, I own the risk now too. Along the back of the concession room was an interior wall, and in that wall was a steel door, and that steel door was the reason she had emptied her coffee can. It was painted the same green as the rest of the trim, and somebody had painted right over the hasp and the padlock in some long ago year of maintenance, so the paint had bridged the shackle and gone brittle and cracked, which told her better than any county form that the lock had not been opened since before that paint dried. Above the door, stenciled by hand in white letters with a brush that had been too dry, was one word, booth, and below that, smaller, in the same hand, no one passed this door but W. Pruitt. She put her palm flat on the steel. It was cold. She said, out loud, to a room with nothing in it but pigeons, "Well, Mr. Pruitt, I have got the paper on it now." She tried the door that first day and could not open it. The padlock was a heavy brass thing, sound under its skin of paint, and the hasp was through a staple set in the block, and she had brought nothing but a tire iron and her own stubbornness. She spent an hour on it and skinned 2 knuckles and then made herself stop, because she was 71 years old and alone on a condemned property 3.5 miles from town, and Ray had always said that the second hour of a job you should not have started is where people get hurt. So she walked the field until the light went orange. She found the ticket booth by the entrance, a little octagon with a cash drawer still in it and a roll of orange paper tickets swollen fat with damp. She found the playground down front of the first ramp where the swings had been, 2 A-frames and no swings, and the concrete pad where the merry-go-round had stood. She found lying in the grass a metal sign that had fallen off its post. And she turned it over with her shoe and read, in letters a foot high, "Please dim your headlamps." And she laughed for the first time in 6 weeks, all by herself, out loud, in a field. She came back the next morning at 7 with Ray's toolbox in the truck bed, a hacksaw, a can of penetrating oil, a broom, a flashlight with new batteries, and 2 ham sandwiches, because she was not going to be the kind of fool who goes out there without sandwiches. It took her 40 minutes with the oil and the hacksaw resting her arm every dozen strokes, and she cut through the shackle at 10 minutes after 8 on a Wednesday morning in April, and the padlock fell into her hand, heavier than she had expected, warm from the sawing. The hasp did not want to lift. She got the tire iron under it, and it came. And the paint cracked all the way around the door frame in one long tearing line, and then the door swung in about 4 inches on its own weight and stopped, and out of that 4-inch gap came the smell. It was not a bad smell. That was what surprised her most, standing there with her heart going like a bird in a box. It was hot metal and machine oil and carbon and something faintly sweet like vinegar, the smell of a room that had been sealed while it was still warm and had spent 46 years slowly cooling. She pushed the door the rest of the way with the flat of her hand, and the light from the broken skylight over the concession counter went past her into a long, narrow room, and she saw the machines. There were 2 of them, and they stood in the middle of the floor like 2 black iron animals that had been told to wait and had waited. Each one was taller than she was, mounted on a heavy pedestal base bolted through the concrete, with a great round upper magazine on top and a matching one below, so that each machine had the silhouette of a figure 8 standing on a column. The lens housings pointed at the wall, and in that wall were 3 openings cut through the block and fitted with glass, 2 square projection ports and 1 wider observation port, and every one of them was still shuttered with a little hinged steel flap on a counterweight. Dust lay on everything in a gray felt 1/8 of an inch thick, undisturbed, unmarked, without a single track or paw print or drip, and the dust told her the roof had held and the door had held and the room had simply been left. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she stepped in, because it felt like walking into somebody's Sunday parlor without being asked. Then she stepped in. The floor was painted concrete, gray, worn down to bare in 2 paths. One path from the door to the near projector, one from the near projector to the far one, the tracks a man's feet make over 30 years of the same 40 steps. The room ran the whole width of the building behind the concession counter, maybe 40 feet long and 12 deep, and it was crowded the way a working shop is crowded, which is to say, everything had a place and was in it. Along the back wall stood a steel rewind bench with a hand crank rewinder at one end and a splicer clamped at the other and a green shaded lamp bolted over it. Beside the bench was a tall gray equipment rack with a dozen amplifier panels in it, each panel with a Bakelite knob and a cloth-covered wire coming out the back and a strip of masking tape with a word written on it in pencil. Ramp 1 through 4, Ramp 5 through 7. Playground, booth monitor. Above the bench, a corkboard, and pinned to the corkboard, curled and yellowed but perfectly legible, a shipping order, a carbon copy of a booking confirmation, and a paper card with 2 columns of numbers that turned out to be arc amperage settings for 2 different reel stocks. And on the workbench, under the green lamp, set square on a folded rag, a coffee cup with a 1/4 inch of something black and hard in the bottom of it, and beside the cup, an ashtray with 3 cigarette ends in it, and beside the ashtray, a pair of cotton gloves laid flat with the fingers straight, the way a careful man puts his gloves down when he means to come back in the morning. She had to sit down. There was a chair, a wooden swivel chair with a cushion tied to the seat, and she moved it out from the bench and sat in it and put both hands on her knees and breathed. Dust came up around her in a slow cloud and turned gold in the shaft of light from the door. Somewhere out in the field, a meadowlark was going, that long falling whistle. And it came through the block wall thin and far away, and Adeline Merrick sat in a dead man's chair in a sealed room and understood, in a way she had not understood at the courthouse or in the truck or standing in front of the screen, that she had bought something real. When she could, she got up and looked at the machines properly. The near one had a brass plate on the base, and she wiped it with her thumb and read the maker's name and a serial number and the words Model C, and under that, on a separate riveted tag, a lamp house manufacturer and the words Carbon Arc. She knew what a carbon arc was in the general way that a farm woman knows things, that it was two sticks of carbon brought close together and a current run across the gap to make a light hot enough to throw a picture the length of a football field, and that they had to be fed in by hand as they burned. He opened the little mica window on the side of the lamp house and looked in, and there they were. Two stubs of carbon rod in their jaws, burned down to a couple of inches, the tips still bearing the pitted crater the arc leaves, and the inside of the housing coated in fine gray ash. The last light this room had made was still sitting in there. Then she found the film. It was on the machine. The upper magazine of the near projector had a weight to it when she put her hand on the housing, and when she unlatched the lid and swung it back, there was a reel in there with maybe a third of its film still wound on it, and the film ran down out of the magazine and through the gate and the sound head and down into the lower magazine, threaded, laced through every roller and sprocket. Exactly as a man leaves it when he starts a reel. It had run to the end of the show and stopped. She touched the film with one finger. It was cool and slightly ridged and had a smell like old candle wax. Along the edge, when she held her flashlight at an angle, she could read the tiny printed frame numbers and a word, and beyond the gate, where the film had sat in one position for 46 years. The picture in that one frame had gone faintly brown at the edges from the heat that had been in the gate when the lamp shut off. She did not try to unthread it. She left it exactly where it was, because it seemed to her that this was the last thing a man had done in his working life, and it was not hers to undo before somebody who knew better had looked at it. And then she raised the flashlight and turned around and put the beam on the wall behind her, the wall she had walked past twice without looking at, and the beam went along a run of steel shelving that went from the doorway to the far corner of the room, 4 shelves high, and on those shelves, stacked flat, edge on, in rows and columns, in more rows behind those, were the cans. Film cans, round, flat steel cans, silver and rust bloomed and painted and taped, some the size of a dinner plate and some the size of a wagon wheel, and every one of them with a strip of masking tape or a paper label or a chalk mark on the rim. She swept the light along the run, and the shelves kept going. She stopped counting at 140, and she was not a third of the way down. She read the labels the way a person reads gravestones, slowly, one hand on the shelf. Some of them were what she expected, the names of pictures, feature titles she half remembered from the years when a person still said, "Let us go out to the show," each one in 4 or 5 cans with the real number circled. Those she understood. It was the other labels that made her stop and put her flashlight down on the bench and pick it back up again. They were written in pencil, in a small square hand, and they did not say the names of pictures at all. Harvest Home Parade, Arden Grove, one said, and a date in September of 1954. Another said County Fair, Livestock Ring, with a year. Another said Water Tower Goes Up. Another said high school commencement, and then a year, and beside it another can with the same words, and the next year, and beside that another and another, and the row of them went along the shelf like a fence, one for every June. She found flood, May, and a year she remembered in her body, because she had been 22 years old that May and had helped fill sandbags at the creek bridge with her hair tied up in a scarf. She found Last Day at the Depot. She found Centennial and 3 cans of it. She found on the second shelf a can labeled in the same pencil hand, Merrick Brothers Threshing, and a year. And she had to hold the edge of the shelf. Ray's father and his uncle had run a threshing outfit until the middle 50s. She had never seen a picture of it that moved. There was nobody to tell any of this to. She stood in a sealed room with a flashlight and about 400 film cans, and there was not one living soul within 3.5 miles, and she found that she was talking anyway, saying, "Well, look at that, and Would you look at what he did out loud in the dust, the way people talk when the thing in front of them is too big to hold quietly? Then she found the book. It was on the bench under the green lamp, a hardbound ledger with a marbled cover and a cloth spine, and the front of it said, in ink, Meadowlark, booth log, and under that a name, Wendell Pruitt, projectionist. She opened it, and the pages had gone the color of weak tea, and the ink had gone brown, but every line of it was there, ruled columns filled in by hand, date, feature, reels, house count. Weather, and a last narrow column headed simply notes. She turned to the back. The last entry was dated the 9th of September, 1979. Feature 1 and Feature 2 were listed. House count, 31 cars. Weather, clear, wind south, cool, and in the notes column, in that same small square hand, written a little larger than the rest as if the man had known it deserved the room. The words, last show, closing by order, arc down at 11:40, doors locked, everything left as is against a better year. She read that sentence 4 times, sitting in his chair. Against a better year. He had not shut the place down. He had put it away. He had run the second feature to the end for 31 carloads of people who would never come back. And then he had killed the ark and wound down and set his gloves on the bench and turned off the green lamp and walked out and put a padlock on his own door and had, somewhere in the back of his mind, expected to come back and open it. She learned the rest of it in town over the next week, in pieces, because a town like Arden Grove hands you a story in pieces. Wendell Pruitt had run the booth at the Meadowlark from the year it opened in 1949 until the night it shut 30 years, and he had been a bachelor and a fussy man and had lived in 3 rooms above the barber shop. When the theater closed, the family that owned it had already moved to Colorado and had simply let it sit. And the taxes had lapsed and been paid and lapsed again through the estates of 2 generations, and the county had finally taken title only 4 years ago and had put a placard on the door and priced the whole business at what it was owed. Wendell Pruitt had taken a job at the grain elevator scale house and worked there 11 more years and had died in the winter of 1991. Aged 78, and was buried out at Bethel with a stone that said his name and his dates and nothing else. Nobody had ever asked him for the key. That was the part Adeline could not get past, sitting in the front room on Ash Street with her supper going cold. He had lived 11 more years in a town 3.5 miles from that booth. And in 11 years, not one soul had walked up to him and said, "Wendell, what is in there?" The town had decided the Meadowlark was junk, and once a town decides a thing is junk, it stops seeing it, and a man can carry a key in his pocket for 11 years and be asked about the weather instead. Word got around about the sale, of course, the way it does. The county paper ran 3 lines in the courthouse column, surplus parcel 19 sold at auction, and gave her name, and by the following Monday, everybody in Arden Grove knew that Ray Merrick's widow had spent her last $2,900 on the dead drive-in. Junie Salas at the diner told her, kindly, that people were talking, and then told her what they were saying. Because Junie was the sort of friend who does not spare you the second half. They were saying she had gone soft after the house sale. They were saying it was grief. A man at the counter, a fellow named Deke Ferris, who had never in his life put money into anything but a truck, said out loud, with Adeline sitting 4 stools down, that the county ought to be ashamed taking an old woman's money for a pile of rust, and that the kindest thing anybody could do for her was go out there with a dozer and put it out of its misery. Adeline set down her cup and said, "Deke, when I want your opinion on my property, I will drive out to yours and ask for it." And Junie laughed into the pie case, and that was the first time in 6 weeks that anybody in Arden Grove had heard Ada Merrick sound like herself. Dean called on the Tuesday. She had been expecting it since Monday noon and had rehearsed 4 different answers. And when the phone rang, she used none of them. He did not shout. Dean had never been a shouter, which in some ways would have been easier. He said, "Mom," and then he said her name, and then he said, "Tell me it is not true." And when she said that it was, he made a long sound through his nose and said, $2,900 for a field with a condemned building on it. Mom, do you understand that you cannot insure that? Do you understand that if a kid goes out there on a 4-wheeler and gets hurt, they come after you, and you have got nothing left for them to come after because you spent it? She said that the county had the same paperwork he did and had sold it to her anyway. He said the county was thrilled to sell it to her. The county had been trying to give that eyesore away for 4 years, and that was exactly the point. Then he said the thing that stayed with her. He said, "I had it offered to me." She asked him what he meant. He said Burntiel had called him in February before the sale went to the paper, because that is how it works. The clerk gets on the phone and tries to move the ugly parcels quietly. And Byrne had said, "Dean, you are in property. Do you want 14 acres of highway frontage north of town for what is owed on it?" And Dean had laughed and said, "Byrne, that is a landfill with a screen on it," and he had told him no. He told her this as evidence. He said, "Mom, I turned it down, and I turn down deals for a living. That is what I am telling you." He was very calm about it. He said he would look into whether the sale could be unwound and asked her not to go out there alone, and said Shauna would bring supper Thursday, and by the time he hung up, she was holding the phone with both hands and looking at the wall. She did not tell him about the booth. She had opened her mouth twice to do it, and both times something in her had closed the door quietly and stood in front of it, and afterward, sitting there, she was not proud of that exactly, but she was not sorry either. There are things a person needs to have all the way through before she hands them to somebody who will start pricing them. What she did instead was go and find Otis Ranney. Otis was 80 and lived out at the Fairhaven Apartments and had been the ticket taker at the Meadowlark from the summer he turned 16, and when Adeline told him what she had bought, he put down his coffee so hard it went over the rim. He made her drive him out that afternoon. She had to help him across the grass, and he swore at his own knees the whole way. And when they came around the corner of the concession building, and he saw the green door standing open, he stopped dead and said, "No," he said, "that door has been shut since I was 19 years old." He would not go in for a full minute. And then he did, and he stood in the middle of that room in his windbreaker with his cap in his hands. And he looked at the 2 machines and at the bench and at the gloves lying flat with their fingers straight, and he said, in a completely different voice, that is exactly how he kept it. Otis was the one who told her what she was looking at, more or less. He said the machines were the originals, put in when the place was built. And the reason they were still there was that the family had never sold them, because in 1979, every drive-in in the country was closing at once, and there was not a buyer left alive for a pair of carbon arc heads. He said Wendell had run those 2 lamps by hand, feeding carbon all through every show, and that Wendell had never once let the light go yellow at a changeover in 30 years, which Otis said was the mark of the man the way another man's mark might be a straight fence. And then Adeline showed him the shelves and put the flashlight on the pencil labels, and Otis Ranney read 4 of them out loud. Harvest Home Parade, Water Tower Goes Up, Commencement, Flood May, and then he sat down on the arm of the swivel chair without asking and said, "Oh," he said, "we forgot about those." He told her, then sitting in the dust. Wendell Pruitt had owned a camera, Not a movie camera for a hobby, a proper spring wound 16mm camera he had bought secondhand in 1951, and from that year until the year the place shut, whenever anything happened in Arden Grove or anywhere in Pike County, Wendell had gone and filmed it. The parade, the fair, the high school graduations, every single June, the whole line of them walking, barn raisings, the day they poured the new highway, the last passenger train, ball games, the flood, and then he had cut it and spliced it and made a reel out of it, and on Friday and Saturday nights before the feature started, the Meadowlark had run its own newsreel, 3 or 4 minutes of Pike County, on a 60-foot screen in front of 200 cars. Otis said, "You have got to understand what that was." He said, "Everybody sat in their cars and watched, and when your kid came up on that screen, the whole field would honk." He said his own wedding was in one of them, coming down the church steps in 1964 with rice in the air, and that she was 11 months gone now, and he had not laid eyes on her moving since. He said that last part looking at the floor, and Adeline put her hand on his shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while in a sealed room 3.5 miles from town. After that, she went at it the only way she knew, which was the way you go at a cellar in spring, one shelf at a time with a notebook. She bought a spiral notebook and a box of soft pencils and a package of cotton gloves at the drugstore, and she set up a card table just inside the booth door where the light was, and she began to write down what was on every can. She would not move them at first. She had read somewhere years ago that film could go bad, and she was afraid of doing the wrong thing to something that had lasted 46 years without her, so at first she only wrote, Shelf 1, Bay 1, top row, can, 12-inch, taped, label reads, and then whatever it said. It took her 9 days to get through the first bay. Her back hurt and her knees hurt, and she went home to Ash Street every evening filthy to the elbow and slept better than she had slept since Ray died. Somewhere in the second week, a boy started turning up. His name was Cody Vance. He was 15. He lived on the next place up the highway, and he had come originally to look at the screen tower because he and his friends had been throwing rocks at it for years, which he admitted to her straight out with his ears going red. She put him to work. He could get up and down off a ladder, and she could not. And he could read a label at the back of a shelf where her eyes would not go, and he had the kind of patience that surprises people about 15-year-old boys when somebody finally gives them something that matters. He called her Mrs. Merrick for 2 days, and Ada after that. He also, on the 4th afternoon, said the sentence that changed the size of the thing. He was up the ladder at the top row of the third bay, and he said, Ada, these ones back here are different. She made him bring one down. It was a heavier can, not a shipping can, and when she got it under the light on the card table, she saw that it was not one of Wendell's home labels either. It had a Studios printed label on the lid, a shipping label with a routing block, and a red stencil. And when Cody wiped it with a rag, they both read the same 3 words at once. Property of, and then the studio's name, and under that, return after engagement. Behind it on the shelf were 19 more like it. That night, at the kitchen table on Ash Street, Adeline wrote a letter. She wrote it 4 times to get the tone right. Because she did not want to sound like a crank, and she did not want to sound like a woman who thought she had found treasure, and what she settled on was 6 sentences that said, in plain words, that she had purchased the former Meadowlark Drive-In Theater in Pike County at county sale, that its projection booth had been sealed since September of 1979, and she had opened it. That it contained 2 original carbon arc projectors in place, a booth log covering 30 years, and something over 400 film cans, a large number of them hand-labeled with local Pike County events between 1951 and 1979, and that she did not know what she had and did not want to hurt it, and would somebody please come and look. She addressed it to the State Historical Society, film and media collections, and she put a stamp on it and walked it to the box on the corner in her cardigan at 6:30 in the morning because she could not wait for the mail carrier. The answer came by telephone 8 days later, and the woman on the other end talked so fast that Adeline had to ask her twice to slow down. Her name was Dr. Nadine Croft. She was the film archivist for the state collection. She was 44 years old and had a voice like a person who has been waiting a long time for a phone call. And the first thing she said after her name was, "Mrs. Merrick, please do not open any more cans." And the second thing she said was, "Can I come Thursday?" She came Thursday. She came in a state car with a young assistant named Praveen and a plastic tub of white gloves and thermometers and a light meter and a thing on a tripod that Adeline could not name. And she walked into the concession building and through the green door and stopped in the middle of the booth floor, exactly the way Otis Ranney had stopped, and said one word, which was, "Oh." She stood there with her hands at her sides. She turned all the way around once. She looked at the two machines and at the ports in the wall with their counterweighted shutters and at the rewind bench and at the cork board with the shipping order still pinned to it and at the gloves lying flat. And she said, quietly, "This is not a survival. This is an interior." Adeline asked her what that meant. Dr. Croft said that plenty of old equipment survives. You find heads in barns and lamp houses and scrap yards, and every so often a booth survives with the machines still in it. But what almost never survives is the room, because the room is what people clear out first. The bench and the log and the tape and the labels and the way the man arranged his own working life. And that a booth that has been sealed with the ephemera in place is worth more as a whole than the sum of everything in it, and that she had seen photographs of two like it in the country and had never stood in one. Then she put her hand on the near projector very lightly and said, "And this one is still threaded." They worked 11 days in that room. Dr. Croft and Praveen and a rotating pair of graduate students, and every single day, Adeline Merrick and Cody Vance, and at the end of it, there was a typed inventory 41 pages long, and Adeline had learned more about what she owned than she had ever expected to know about anything. There were 462 cans on the shelves. Of those, 206 held commercial feature material, most of it prints that had been legitimately junked to the theater at the end of their runs, which was a thing distributors did when it cost more to ship a worn print back than to let the house destroy it, and Wendell Pruitt had signed the destruction certificates and then quietly not destroyed anything. 19 of those cans were the ones with the studio stencils, prints that had never gone back, and 2 of the 19 made Dr. Croft leave the booth and stand out in the field with her phone for 20 minutes, and when she came back in, she said, in a careful, flat voice, that a picture from 1953 that the studio's own vault records listed as lost, with no complete element known anywhere, appeared to be sitting on shelf 3, bay 2, in 5 cans, and that she would like Adeline's permission to have a colleague fly in. Adeline said yes. She said it the way you say yes when somebody asks to use your telephone. But the 256 other cans were the ones that made the 11 days feel like a slow flood coming up over the floor. Those were Wendell's. Those were the ones in pencil. Sorted and listed and cross-checked against the booth log and against the dates written on the leader, they came to 28 years of Pike County from a can marked simply first try, June 1951, to a reel labeled with a date 3 weeks before the theater closed. There were, and Dr. Croft read this part out to her twice off the page because Adeline kept saying, "Wait," say that again, 26 consecutive years of high school commencement. Every June from 1953 to 1978, the whole line of graduates walking. Filmed from the same corner of the gymnasium floor, in the same order with the same slow pan. There were 31 parades. There were 9 years of the county fair livestock ring and 4 cans of the centennial and the pouring of the highway and the day the water tower went up in 1959 with a man standing on the top rail waving his hat. There was the flood, 4 reels of it, and Dr. Croft said the flood footage alone would be studied. Because there was no other moving picture of that event anywhere, and the state had been asking about it for years. There were funerals, filmed respectfully from the back. There were, in a bay by themselves, 16 cans, marked elevator, threshing, harvest, with different farm names on them, and one of them said Merrick Brothers and Dr. Croft, who by then understood the household. Put that can in Adeline's hands herself and let her hold it for a while, and did not say a single word. What it added up to, the archivist said on the last evening, sitting on an overturned bucket with the 41 pages on her knee, was the most complete continuous amateur record of a single American county that she had ever personally seen, held in one place by one hand. With a logbook that dated and explained nearly all of it, she said the word that Adeline kept afterward. She said, "This is not a collection, Mrs. Merrick. This is a memory." One county remembered itself for 28 years and then locked the door on it. The equipment people came the week after and were, in their own way, worse. 2 men and a woman from a projection society drove 11 hours to be there, and they went over those 2 machines with inspection lamps and dial gauges for a day and a half. And the oldest of them, a man with hands like a mechanic's and a canvas roll of tools he had brought from home, straightened up at the end of it and told her that the intermittent movements on both heads were tight, that the gear trains had oil in them, that the sealed room and the cold, dry Nebraska winters had done what no museum could afford to do, and that with cleaning, new belts, a rewired panel, and a great deal of care, both machines would run. Not display. Run, he said, "Ma'am. There are maybe a dozen houses in this country that can still strike a carbon arc for an audience. And there is no reason on earth this cannot be the 13th. Then he asked her, almost shyly, whether she had had the wiring looked at, and Adeline said the power had been off since 1979, and the man said, "Well, that is a phone call." It was more than a phone call as it happened. The Rural Electric Cooperative sent a lineman out named Wes Hobart, who found the old service drop and the meter socket and the main panel in the concession building, and told her flat that the panel was a museum piece of the bad kind and would all have to come out, and that the transformer on the pole was still good. He wrote her a number on the back of a work order. It was more money than she had, which was not a difficult bar to clear anymore, since she had $211 and a truck. But by then, and this was the part she had not planned and could not have planned, she was no longer the only person in Pike County interested in what was out there. Word had gotten out the way it does, through the diner and the co-op and the Methodist basement, and it had turned over completely in about 9 days. Junie Salas printed a page of the inventory and taped it up by the register, and people stood at that register with their coffee going cold, reading a list of dates, looking for their own years. Deke Ferris, who had offered to bulldoze the place, came out on a Saturday with a brush cutter in his truck bed and never said one word about the earlier conversation, and mowed the first 3 ramps down to stubble in an afternoon. The volunteer fire department, which liked an excuse, came out and pumped 6 years of standing water out of the low corner by the playground. The high school shop teacher brought 6 students in a trailer, and they hauled out the raccoon ceiling and rebuilt the concession roof deck in 2 weekends. And the FA chapter took on the speaker post as a project and went down the ramps with wire brushes and a can of primer, 311 of them, and every one of the little gray speaker heads was carried into the booth and set out in rows on the concrete like a congregation. Otis Ranney appointed himself, without ever using the word, the historian, and sat in a lawn chair by the concession door, telling anybody who came where the popcorn machine had been and what a car full cost in 1962, which was $1.50 carload, and the county came out too, because the county had to. That was the 11th of June, a Wednesday, hot and bright, with a wind out of the south moving the grass on the unmowed ramps. Gerald Pike had been the Pike County assessor for 19 years, no relation to the county's name and tired of saying so, a narrow man in a short-sleeved shirt with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, and absolutely no expectation about his afternoon. He had come because the parcel had changed hands and the improvements were listed as condemned, and an assessor is obliged to look at what he is valuing at least once in his life. He brought a young deputy assessor with him to hold the other end of the tape. There were, by the accident of the day, a good many other people out there. The FIFA had 8 kids on the ramps. Dr. Croft and Praveen were up from the state, boxing the last of shelf 4 into archival cases. The Projection Society man had come back with a crate of parts. Bernard Teal had driven out from the courthouse on his lunch in his shirt sleeves, ostensibly with a copy of the recorded deed for her file, and actually because he could not stand not seeing it. Junie had brought a cooler. Cody Vance was up a ladder. Somewhere near 25 people were standing on that 14 acres when Gerald Pike walked into the booth. He was in there a long time. Adeline waited outside in the shade of the canopy with her notebook because it seemed the polite thing, and she could hear him in there asking questions in the flat voice of a man doing arithmetic. And she heard Dr. Croft answering, and once she heard him say that again. When he came out, he did not look like the same man who had gone in. His face had gone the color of the concrete. He stood in the doorway with his clipboard down at his side, and he did not seem to know he had stopped walking. And he looked out over the field at the ramps and the speaker posts and the screen tower standing up white in the sun, and then he looked at Adeline Merrick in her oatmeal cardigan with her pencil behind her ear, and he said, out loud, in front of every soul standing in that field, "Mrs. Merrick, I have got to tell you that the county has been carrying this parcel on the roll at $4,100, land and improvements together, as a condemned property with no contributory value." He stopped and swallowed. He said the land alone, 14 acres with 400 feet of highway frontage, comes in at $98,000. He said, "The screen tower and the buildings I will have to bring somebody in on, because I cannot value a structure I have no comparable for, but they are not zero, and I have been calling them zero for 4 years." And then he looked at his clipboard and back up and said the part that people in Arden Grove repeated to each other for a year afterward. He said, "And the contents of that room, which conveyed to you on the deed, which the county described in its own schedule as equipment therein, the state's people are telling me the archive alone is insured at $1,100,000, and they say that number is conservative. And the 2 machines in there are, in their words, one of a dozen operable installations left in the country. And I do not have a line on my form for any of it." He put his hand over his mouth for a second, which is not a thing assessors do. Then he said, "Ma'am, I have been the assessor here for 19 years, and I want to say this where people can hear me. We had this on the books as garbage. You are the only person in this county who read the schedule." Nobody clapped, because it was not that kind of moment. What happened was that 25 people stood in a field in the middle of a Wednesday and went completely quiet, and then Bernard Teal said, "Well," and took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt, and Junie Salas sat down on the cooler, and Cody Vance said, from the top of the ladder, in the voice of a 15-year-old who has just understood the size of his summer, "No way." Adeline herself did not say anything for a while. She had known in pieces for 6 weeks. She had known since Dr. Croft first said the word insured on a telephone. But there is a difference between knowing a thing in your own kitchen and hearing the county assessor say it out loud in daylight with your neighbors listening, and what she mostly felt, standing there, was not triumph. It was closer to relief and under the relief. Something she could only think of as vindication for a man she had never met, because every number Gerald Pike had read off that clipboard was really a receipt for 30 years of a bachelor projectionist carrying a camera to other people's parades. Dean came out that evening. She had known he would, the moment the assessor opened his mouth in front of witnesses, because there is no faster wire in a small county than the one that carries a dollar figure. He parked his car at the gate rather than driving up the gravel, and he walked in across the mowed ramps in his good shoes with his tie loose, and she watched him come from the concession canopy and thought, with a tiredness that surprised her, here we are. He got about 10 feet from her and stopped and looked around the field, at the screen tower, at the prime speaker posts standing in their rows, at the light on in the booth window where the Projection Society man was working. And he said, Mom. And then he said, I did not know. She said she believed him. He said, I want you to know I did not know when I said it. And she said she believed that too. Then he said, is it true? What Pike said, 1 million. And she watched her son's face while he said the number, and she saw him not be able to help it, and she was not even angry. She said, Dean, sit down on that bucket a minute. He sat on the bucket. She told him about the paint over the padlock. She told him about the gloves lying flat with the finger straight and what that had told her about a man expecting to come back and about the sentence in the log against a better year. She told him what Otis had said about the honking, that when your kid came up on that screen, the whole field would honk. And she said, you asked me at my kitchen table in March what I thought I was going to do with $2,900, and I did not have an answer for you then, and I want to give you one now. He said, I did not buy an investment. I did not know what was behind that door, and neither did anybody else. What I bought was the only thing left in this county that nobody had taken away from me yet, which was a piece of ground I could walk onto without asking. Dean Merrick put his elbows on his knees and looked at the grass for a good while, and then he said, quietly, I sold your house. She said, yes, he said. I still think the furnace was going to kill you. She said, it probably was, and that was the closest the two of them ever came to having it out. And in some families, that is what having it out looks like. Then he asked what she was going to do with it. She had the answer ready, because she had been 3 weeks working it out with Bernard Teal and a lawyer in Fremont who charged her nothing and told her he had graduated in 1971 and was on a reel. The archive would go into a nonprofit trust, the Pruitt Collection, held for Pike County, with the State Historical Society taking custody of the originals for cold storage and copying, and the trust holding title and the right of exhibition, and every foot of it to be printed to a form that could be shown here, on this ground, forever. The 19 studio cans would go back to the studio that owned them, including the lost picture, which was not hers and never had been, and about which she said only, I do not want a thing in my possession that has somebody else's name stenciled on the lid. The land, the screen, the buildings, and the booth stayed in her name because Dr. Croft had said something to her that she took to heart, that an interior only survives while somebody lives with it, and the two machines would be repaired and run. Dean said, run for who? She said, for whoever comes. It took until the 22nd of August. The Rural Electric Cooperative set a new service and a new panel and did not send a bill, which Wes Hobart explained by saying the board had voted it in as line loss and that she should not ask him any more questions about it. The Projection Society men came back twice and rebuilt both heads, and on the second visit they let Cody Vance hold the light while they set the intermittent, and that boy did not sleep for 2 days afterward. The screen tower took the longest because 90 feet of screen face has to be washed and patched and rolled with a special white paint by men on a lift. and the co-op sent the lift, and the Methodists sent lunch, and it took 9 days. Somebody found, in a shed on the old ownership's land, 4 boxes of glass neon tubing wrapped in newspaper from 1968. And a sign man out of Grand Island bent what was missing and rehung the meadowlark on the marquee for the cost of the gas to get there. And on the letterboard, where 4 rusted letters had said stay to an empty highway for 46 years, Otis Ranney directed the setting of the new ones from his lawn chair, and what it said by the 3rd week of August was one night, Pike County on film, free, and then on the bottom line, because Adeline insisted on it and would not be talked out of it, Wendell Pruitt, projectionist. They expected maybe 200 cars. Dr. Croft had said gently that people say they will come to these things. The gate opened at 7, and by 8:10 the field was full, and they were parking on the shoulder of the old highway for a quarter mile in both directions, and Deke Ferris was out there in a reflective vest with a flashlight, waving people onto his own hay ground across the road. And the final count, which Bernard Teal did himself with a clicker because he wanted it on paper, was 641 cars and something over 2,000 people in a county of 9,000. They came in pickups and minivans and lawn chairs. They came with grandchildren asleep across the back seat. 4 buses came from the 2 nursing homes in the county, and the aides parked them in a row along the top ramp with the doors open so the residents could hear. And there was one woman up there who was 101 years old and had gone to the Meadowlark on its opening night in 1949. At 9:04, when the sky over the shelter belt had gone the color of a plum, Adeline Merrick climbed the 4 steps into the booth in her good dress with the oatmeal cardigan over it because the evening had turned cool, and stood next to the Projection Society man at the near machine, and he said, "Ma'am, it is your house." He had rigged the striker so she only had to close a knife switch. She closed it. Out in the field, 2,000 people heard a soft, heavy thump through the block wall, and then the screen tower, which had been a gray shape at the north end of a dark field, came up white, 90 feet of it. Brighter than anything in Pike County, so bright that the horn honking started before there was a single picture on it, just for the light. She always said afterward that the light was the part that got her. Then the picture came. It was the newsreel Wendell Pruitt had cut for the 4th of July in 1961, first out of the can and first onto the screen. And it opened on the parade, coming down Main Street in Arden Grove with the marching band in white, and the field went up like a fairground. A man 4 rows back stood up out of his sunroof and shouted, "That is my dad. That is my dad," on the drum. And then everyone was shouting, because the camera was panning, slow, the way that careful man always panned. And Main Street in 1961 had everybody's people on it. They ran 2 hours. They ran the water tower going up, and the man on the top rail waving his hat, and somebody in the crowd yelled his name. They ran the flood, 4 reels of it, and the field got very quiet. And then at the shot of the line of men on the creek bridge passing sandbags there was a sound over that whole field of people saying names to each other in the dark. They ran 9 minutes of the County Fair Livestock Ring from 1966. They ran because Adeline had asked for it particularly and had told nobody. 30 seconds of a wedding party coming down the steps of the Lutheran Church in 1964 with rice in the air, and Otis Ranney sat in a lawn chair in the front row in front of 641 cars and watched his wife come down those steps laughing 11 months after he had buried her, and 2,000 people let him have it without a sound. Dean was there. She had not asked him, and had not been sure until she came out of the booth at the changeover and looked down the second ramp and saw her son's car with the windows down and Shauna in the passenger seat and her two grandchildren sitting up on the hood in their sweatshirts and Dean standing beside the front fender with his arms crossed and his head tipped back, looking at 90 feet of Pike County going by in the dark. She went down and stood next to him, and neither of them said anything for a good while. On the screen, a threshing crew was pitching bundles into a machine on a hillside in the year 1954, and the dust was coming off the blower in a long plume, and the men in the picture were young and quick and did not know they were being remembered. Dean said, "Is that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Which one is Grandpa?" She put her finger up at the screen, which is a foolish thing to do at that distance, and everybody does it, and she said, "On the wagon, with his back to us, the one with the hat pushed up. Look now, he is going to turn around." He turned around. Ray Merrick's father, 29 years old, looked into the camera for about a second and a half and grinned and waved a gloved hand at somebody off to the left of the frame, and then went back to pitching, and Dean Merrick made a small sound and put his hand over the lower half of his face and kept it there. His daughter, who was 9, said, "Is that really him?" And Dean said yes without moving his hand. Shauna got out of the car and came around and stood on the other side of Adeline, and after a minute she said, "Ada, I am sorry." And Adeline said, "I know you are," and took her arm, and that was the whole of that conversation, and it held. Later, when the last reel had run out and the tail had flapped through the gate and the field had turned on its headlights, 641 carloads of people drove past the concession building on their way out, and every single one of them honked, one after another, for 11 minutes, which Cody Vance timed on his phone. The Meadowlark runs 11 nights a year now. It is not a business, and it will never be one. There is a schedule painted on a board by the ticket booth, 4 county nights in the summer, 3 features in the fall, commencement night in June when they run the graduating class of 50 years ago before the new one walks, and the Christmas night when they run nothing but parades. The concession stand sells popcorn at $1, and the money goes to the trust. The state made a print of every foot of Wendell Pruitt's film, and the originals are in a cold vault 300 miles away, where they will outlive everybody now living, and the studio wrote a letter about the picture from 1953, a very careful letter with lawyers in the middle of it, and then sent a second letter that was not careful at all from a woman in their preservation department who wrote by hand at the bottom, "Thank you. We thought this was gone. We have been looking for 40 years. Dr. Croft comes twice a year and brings students. Gerald Pike put the parcel back on the roll at a number he had to write on a special form and told the Board of Equalization, on the record, that he had been valuing the county's own memory at nothing for 4 years and would like that noted in the minutes. Otis Ranney died in February of the following year, 91 years old, and the family had the funeral at Bethel, and afterward 200 people drove out to the Meadowlark in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in the cold, and Adeline struck the arc in daylight, which you are not supposed to do and which does not show much, and ran 30 seconds of a wedding on the church steps in 1964 for a field full of running engines, and everybody honked. As for Adeline Merrick, she lives out there. There are 2 rooms behind the concession stand that used to be the manager's office and a storeroom, and the shop class framed them out and put in a bathroom and a little kitchen, and the county inspector who lifted the condemnation walked through it twice and signed. She has her mother's clock on the wall and her canning jars on a shelf and Ray's toolbox by the door, and out her back window is 14 acres with the ramps mowed and 311 speaker posts standing in rows and a screen the size of a barn end catching the last of the sun. She keeps the booth herself. She learned to thread both machines at 72 years old, and she can strike an arc and hold it, though she lets Cody do the changeovers now because he is quicker, and he is at the State University studying, of all the things in this world, film preservation, on a scholarship the trust pays for. The wooden swivel chair stays where it was. The green shaded lamp is on the bench. She washed the coffee cup, which Dr. Croft said was a shame, and which Adeline said she could live with, but the cotton gloves are still lying flat with the fingers straight, where a man left them on the 9th of September, 1979, and she has never moved them, and she never will. Her son comes out on Sundays with the grandchildren, and he mows, and he does not talk about property. And when people ask her, as strangers do now, whether she had any idea what was behind that door when she raised her hand in the courthouse basement, Adeline Merrick tells them the truth, which is no. She says she was a 71-year-old woman with a coffee can who had just watched her whole life get carried out onto a lawn and priced at $4 a place setting, and that she had wanted one thing left in the world with her name on the paper, and that the county had written down exactly what she was buying and handed it across the counter, and that not one person in Pike County, including her, had ever bothered to read the last line of it. Then she usually adds the other thing, the thing she says at the start of every county night from a microphone on the concession canopy with the field going quiet in front of her. She says, "This was not mine." She says a man named Wendell Pruitt spent 30 years pointing a camera at people who never once asked him to, and then put it all away behind a steel door against a better year. And he was right to. She says, "This is the better year." And then she goes up the 4 steps into the booth and closes the knife switch, and the light comes on.